I believe you have already watched tons of reviews on the brand new iPhone 15 Pro by the moment you click on this video. So today we're going straight forward to this new chip, the A17 Pro. This isn't just any chip, it's Apple's first A-series processor with the Pro label. Want to know how it performs? We've got a full deck for you, from an in-depth look into its architecture to our signature power efficiency curve, along with the real-world gaming tests and thermal and battery life tests. We also test some real AAA games ported from PC and tested the latest MetalFX Upscaling feature. Can't wait to get started! Without further ado, let's dive into it. First off, let's recap some highlights from Apple's keynote. A17 Pro is the first chip made by TSMC's 3nm node. On the CPU front, they enhanced branch prediction, wider decode unit, and execution engine. This suggests the CPU's microarchitecture has undergone a considerable shift, potentially the most significant since A14 and M1 era. Along with these architectural changes, Apple has also cranked up the frequencies, the P-cores now clocking at an unprecedented 3.78 GHz, and the E-cores are at 2.11 GHz. The GPU has also seen a major overhaul, now incorporating ray tracing and mesh shading support. This means the features are starting to align with some desktop GPUs. We'll delve into its performance, efficiency, and how Apple's version of DLSS, MetalFX Upscaling, performs on your smartphone. Lastly, both versions of iPhone 15 Pro now boast 8 gigs of RAM. Although they didn't mention it in the keynote, but if you know iPhone well, you know this is legendary. So from now on, we're gonna talk about a lot of professional crap, some really deep stuff, and I know some of you just want to see the straightforward results per se, so feel free to jump the timeline. Okay, let's take a look at the A17 Pro's CPU microarchitecture. Compared to A16, the A17 Pro has made some notable changes to its performance core. The decoder width has been expanded from 8 to 9, allowing for decoding up to 9 instructions per clock cycle, marking the first increase since A14. Additionally, the number of ALUs has also been upped from 6 to 8, which enhanced the backend instruction throughput, matching the increase in encoders. For those of you interested in a detailed breakdown, including E-cores, we prepared a complete architectural diagram. Do keep in mind that is for reference, and there may be minor discrepancies. Now we know what it looks like, we have to analyze it deeper by benchmarks. Thanks to Junjie 1475, we are now able to run all the tests of SPEC 2017 on iOS. In case you don't know, SPEC CPU 2017 is an industry standard of CPU benchmark. And if we need to do any microscopic analyzing on processor, we need to go through SPEC rate to properly understand the single core performance and efficiency. And also, we've introduced precise core power consumption measurements and the real-time core frequencies. That's right, we can now measure the exact CPU power draw on iPhone. In terms of thermal solution during tests, we got two standards. For the microarchitecture test and peak benchmarks, we need to control variables for better analyzing, so throttling is unacceptable. We have to control the temperature by braking mechanism in software and also using tech cooler for all devices. But for real-world tests following up, they're not gonna get any assistance. No coolers, no help, we're gonna test iPhone thermal performance on its own. And spoiler alert, it's still not so good. So here's our results on SPEC CPU 2017. Let's start with integer tests. Thanks to the new architecture and boosted clock speed, the A17 Pro outperforms A16 across all benchmarks. Overall, the integer performance boost over the A16 is about 10%. And the floating point test told a similar story, where the improvements stands around 7%. Note that even with our specialized cooling, we do observe our A17 Pro still experience some degree of throttling during the test. Combine all these factors together, I would say the performance boost this year is only marginally approach what Apple claimed. If we set aside the clock speed boost and compare the performance at the same frequency, both integer and floating point segment rose by about 3%. So there is indeed an IPC improvement, but really not too much. And we stumbled upon something interesting in our test. Coincidentally, in some of our tests, A17 Pro throttled to the same frequency as A16. And guess what? The power draw stays the same at 3 watts. Ouch! Talk about a huge leap in the 3nm efficiency, huh? Well, based on the results of SPEC 2017, the architectural upgrade of the A17 Pro certainly delivers some performance boost. With a higher IPC and increased frequency, the peak performance naturally surged. However, the peak power consumption of this A17 Pro seems a tad high. I don't know if TSMC's 3nm node generally improved anything. I'm getting a bit nervous about that. That is how A17 Pro compares to its own peers, but now let's see how it fares against the current Android frontrunner, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. It supports a 3.36 GHz Cortex-X3 Prime core, representing the peak of Android power right now. When putting these two titans head-to-head, it's like they are playing in different leagues. The A17 Pro dances ahead with a performance gap over 40% in integer tasks and shoots even further in floating point. Even if we set aside the frequency difference, at the same clock speed, the A17 Pro's IPC still outperforms 8 Gen 2 by some hefty numbers. Dude, are these chips even from the same era? But I have to say, with great performance comes great power draw. With that electrifying performance and architecture, the A17 Pro's core power consumption is genuinely sky high. Factoring the entire motherboard's consumption, iPhone 15 Pro with its P-core draws over 40% more in integer tasks and over 30% in floating point than Xiaomi 13 with X3 at the peak. On the Mac, this level of power consumption might not be a big deal, but for this little piece of phone here, the iPhone, this kind of hunger for power poses a huge strain. According to SPEC 2017, we plotted the power efficiency curve for various top-tier CPU cores out there, and here is where the A17 Pro's P-core sits on the chart. After discussing the supercharged P-core, let's take a look at the E-cores. Actually, this is the first time in history we've been able to, directly test Apple Silicon's E-core. Now, I'm always curious about this mysterious little core here in my iPhone, and today we finally get some answers. Straight to the results from SPEC 2017, the A17 Pro's E-core has made a significant leap comparing to A16's, about 20% for both integer and floating points. Diving deeper into this, if we focus on IPC, the new E-cores showcase a roughly 15% improvement in both tests, which is indeed a sizable boost. So how about comparing this E-core to Team Android, the A510 little core here? At the same power consumption, the A17 Pro's E-core presents some mind-boggling numbers against the A510. 2.6 times faster in integer and 4.4 times faster in floating point. Apple actually said their E-cores are 3 times more efficient than competitors, and well, they're certainly being modest, I think. Maybe we should compare the mid-core A715 from Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. We locked the A715 at a frequency close to A17 Pro's E-core, and here's where things get spooky. The A17 Pro's E-core, which is meant to be energy efficient, astonishingly edges out this A715 in performance metrics. While it slightly trails in integer calculations, it notably surpassed the A715 in floating point. In terms of power efficiency, the story is even more compelling. When the A17 Pro's E-core is flexed to match the performance of the A715, its platform power is way lower than the A715 platform. Of course, being a mid-core, the A715 can ramp up to a much higher frequency, and at the peak of 2.8 GHz, it certainly outstrips Apple's E-cores, but that could come with a whole different power level. Wrapping up the spec test, the P-core showcases a robust performance boost, with the IPC seeing a modest uptick and the overall performance stepping up a notch. However, cranking up the frequency comes with the cost of a huge power consumption, and when matching against the A16, it doesn't seem to fare any better in terms of power efficiency. In contrast, the E-core's performance has taken a commendable leap, with its IPC now on par with Android's mid-cores, and all in all, the spec results are still nice, but with the shift to 3nm, we surprisingly didn't see any benefits in terms of power efficiency. It's just mediocre, to be honest. Well, enough of the nerd stuff. Let's now enter the arena of processor and try some easy-to-understand benchmarks. We line up those flagship mobile chips side by side, and peaking at Geekbench 5 CPU single-core scores, and the A17 Pro scores about 14% better than A16, and 44% better than Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. That 3.8 GHz boost isn't messing around. The multi-core performance received a slightly smaller boost, aligning well with Apple's narrative. Overall, this A17 Pro is still the fastest mobile chip on the planet. But what about the power consumption? Well, with such a skyrocketed multi-core scoring over 6,000, it draws a staggering 14 watts of power. Wow! I'm pretty sure this is probably the most power-hungry chip we've ever met. To be fair, this 14 watt of Frankenstein is just for the peak point. If we look at the lower frequency, the power efficiency isn't bad at all. Comparing to A16 at the same performance, the A17 Pro actually slips slightly less juice. But if you're hoping for a drastic improvement in efficiency, well, it is not here yet. Seems like we might have to wait a bit longer. Now we know the CPUs pretty well, let's try to figure out what this GPU really is. And the reality is pretty brutal. The A17 Pro's GPU hasn't even surpassed the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, which has already launched almost a year ago. That is a bit awkward. Well, at least they're honest about the 20% improvement over A16. But keep in mind, the A16 is already the same thing as A15 in terms of GPU, so anything under 40% is simply unacceptable for me from a leading chip designer like Apple. And what's truly baffling is the GPU's power efficiency. The peak power draw of the A17 Pro's GPU is grown up to 11 watts, and the overall GPU efficiency shows very little improvement comparing to the A15 and A16. To add salt to the wound, its GPU efficiency even lags behind the Dimensity 9200 Plus from MediaTek, and it is nowhere near the league of Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. Damn! A new architecture and a new 3nm process, yet you still get such a poor result? What are you doing, Apple? That is just quite disappointing to say the least. However, there is one area where this A17 Pro's GPU truly shines. It's ray tracing. In our test using the newly launched 3D Mark Solar Bay ray tracing benchmark, A17 Pro displayed a notable lead over Snapdragon. Apple seems to have invested heavily in ray tracing capabilities, although this comes at the cost of power consumption. As we can see, the real strength of the A17 Pro's GPU lies in its desktop-grade features. It is clear that Apple is trying to join the league of the AAA gaming space. Well, maybe we should put it in a test with the Apple-certified AAA title, the Genshin Impact. It's a game that every generation of iPhone seeks to master, and its demands have never been met without a challenge. Upcoming version of Genshin Impact will introduce several new features on iOS, like the MetalFX Upscaling. Think of it as Apple's version of DLSS, enhancing image quality without dragging down the performance. Or it can ease the GPU load while ensuring minimal visual compromise. And with the help of my friends at MiHoYo, we managed to get our hands on the exclusive version of Genshin Impact with MetalFX Upscaling. I must admit, this is the best super resolution I've ever seen on mobile device. Much like DLSS, it leverages the power of NPUs and uses AI to upscale the image. For instance, the clarity of textures here is significantly improved. Elements like the stairs here become much clearer, and the depth in the background foliage is definitely more convincing. Of course, upscaling techniques like this do have their drawbacks. In some places, you might notice some oil painting-ish artifact or over-sharpening. However, when you see those images on your phones, these imperfections are hard to be noticed on such a small screen. I believe this technology greatly enhanced the visual quality of mobile games, or when used in the other direction, like DLSS, it helps reduce power demands. The upcoming MetalFX Super Resolution does show promise, but it still has some way to go before its official release. For now, let's focus on the raw performance of iPhone 15 Pro series when running Genshin Impact without any tricks. The iPhone 15 Pro Max actually runs the game noticeably better than the iPhone 14 Pro Max under Wi-Fi connection. Throughout a 30-minute test in the Thermal City, which is the most demanding part in the game, it consistently hits 60 FPS. And by the end of the test, the surface temperature of the device was 45 degrees, which is within the usual range of iPhones. The smaller iPhone 15 Pro also performed better than its predecessor, particularly in the later half of the test where the frame rate were noticeably steadier. And it does have a healthier power consumption comparing to previous iPhone and Snapdragon phones. It only draws roughly 4 watts of power, so the overall efficiency indeed shows some minor improvement. However, there was one surprising fact. The iPhone 15 Pro surface temperature set a new record in my experience with iPhone, reaching a staggering 48 degrees in games. Furthermore, as expected, the iPhone 15 Pro series still dims the screen midway through our gaming test. And not surprisingly, when we escalate our test to outdoor condition and 5G connection, those iPhones just shrinks massively. I would say Android competitors are still better choice in those thermal demanding scenarios. Apart from Genshin Impact, another title that piqued my curiosity is the iPhone version of Resident Evil Village. Yeah, I believe you already saw the news. Resident Evil is coming to iPhone. It's hard to believe, but here we are trying the test flight version of the game. To my surprise, the asset quality is actually close to its PC and Mac counterparts. It's not compromising too much. Just think about the hardware demand. Quite an achievement. The good news from our test is that even an A14 chip is enough to handle Resident Evil. However, the current version requires at least 6 gigs of RAM. Devices with only 4 gigs of RAM will certainly experience game crashes, and even with 6 gigs, you may still get occasional crashes after a long time gaming. So 8 gigs of RAM would be recommended. The default setting on the iPhone is rather conservative. The preset is 720p with MetalFX enabled and locked at 30 FPS. I guess they did that for the sake of thermals. However, I found the game's config file can be easily modified. So we can tweak it to 1080p mid-quality FPS unlocked, and we can make it comparable with modern PC. To my surprise, current iPhone's performance playing Resident Evil Village isn't far behind handheld gaming PCs like Steam Deck or ROG Ally. With adequate cooling, the A17 Pro can achieve 44 FPS, roughly half the performance of a GTX 1060, superior to Steam Deck but inferior to the Radeon 780M iGPU from AMD. Unfortunately, this is iPhone, so we will see throttling after a very short amount of time. But even with throttling, it still maintains above 30 FPS. We're not even using MetalFX Upscaling here. Considering the processor's power consumption is less than 4 watts during this state, the performance of 1080p 30 FPS is quite impressive. Notably, the A17 Pro appears to throttle earlier than A16. After all, maintaining such a graphic at 44 FPS on your phone is not an easy job. Other than gaming, we still have other things to test out, like thermal performance. We use LinkPack to stress our phones and measure the heat dissipation capabilities of several iPhones and Android phones. And surprisingly, the new iPhone 15 series doesn't seem to have any improvement in its cooling. The Pro Max variant even handles less heat comparing to its predecessor. iPhones are still way inferior to Android competitors on thermal. And I think the overall experience can be largely improved if Apple decides to, enhance the thermal performance of iPhone. Apart from that, I also concerns about the battery life. And to address this, we employed a robotic arm and repeated a 1-hour routine to test the smartphone's battery longevity. The results actually showed some decline in battery life for the two iPhone models with the A17 Pro. the iPhone 15 Pro Max lasts less than its predecessor, and iPhone 15 Pro barely lasts 6 hours. That is quite disappointing, to be honest. You know, battery longevity isn't just about the low-frequency efficiency. Well, it does matter, but if the processor fires up the moment you open an app, if you constantly operate a phone, it will consume a considerable amount of power instantly. Sadly, our battery test cycles, including loading apps from scratch every 10 minutes, and if the device keeps utilizing this aggressive power boost, it will drain the battery quickly. The good news is it can be addressed by restriction on scheduling, so if Apple aims to improve the battery life, I'm kind of looking forward to further upgrades. On the other hand, the battery life of iPhone 15 Plus was surprisingly impressive. Despite not having a larger battery, its battery life exceeded the Pro Max by 2 hours. With the old A16 chip and the 60Hz screen, it is interesting to see its longevity. And finally, we tried to test iPhone's neural engine. It is quite challenging to test it, but we do compile the demo for Stable Diffusion on iPhone, utilizing the Core ML engine to generate image from text. To my surprise, the A16 dramatically outpaced A15, but it seems like the A17 Pro's potential wasn't fully realized. This might be due to the model not being quantized for low precision like Int8, which is more optimized on those new chips. Still, for the first time, we got a glimpse of the A-series NPUs, and as AI is getting more and more important in our daily life, the importance on NPUs might just be on the rise. I do feel like this year's iPhone is quite convincing before I start the review. We got this USB Type-C port, lighter chassis, better camera, new 3nm chip, and all of which made me very exciting. And especially when A16 wasn't improving much, you would naturally think this A17 Pro can deliver that efficiency jump we are all waiting for so long. But sadly, we'll never have it. And now I just feel a bit bad, not only about iPhones, but also about the future of semiconductor industry. The A17 Pro being the first 3nm chip didn't showcase any clear advantage over TSMC's last-gen products electrical-wise. I still don't have the die shot, so I don't know density-wise. But if efficiency isn't improved at all, even with such a huge jump on fabrication, then how can we make better chips from now? It's harder and harder to build chips every year, and unless we find some critical progress, our technology do have a chance to be stagnating pretty soon. Alright, that is the end of today's video. We make this video in maybe 3 days, so if you like it, please like and subscribe to the channel, share it to your friend, and this is Fei from GKOne. Catch you guys next time.